Frank.
My name's Frank Ledridge. I'm a barrister now. Last year I was legal advisor, civilian legal advisor for the task force in Helmand. I remember the most challenging interviews and the most challenging press conferences that we had, both for the military and civilian aspect in Helmand, were the local journalists. They absolutely put us on the rack every time they spoke to us. Now, I would counter that with the experience we had with and I have utmost respect for those folk here, Wildo's people, the British journalists. And there's a good reason for that. The British journalists had, to some extent, to buy into, and I use that term very perhaps a bit too glibly, the narrative, as Peter put it, that we've got. And I give an example of it. The paradigm example of that is the Kajaki Dam route clearance by 16 Air Assault Brigade recently. You may remember, great play was made of a turbine taken from Kandahar to Kajaki. Brigade commander said that in this victorious episode, 200 Taliban were killed. If you read Afghan websites and speak to Afghan journalists, those 200 killed in that operation weren't all by any means Taliban. They were, and they will have included, say they, civilians. So my question to everybody is this: there's a conflict here between the narrative that Peter you spoke about of having to buy into to some degree a created account and what's actually happening, and what more importantly is perceived to be happening by locals on the ground, be that in Central Africa, be that in the Balkans, or especially now in Afghanistan. What Afghans believe to be happening is entirely different.
Absolutely. But I mean, my point would be you don't have to buy into it. I mean, I think it's a mistake. I think that there are easy routes and hard routes, and I think the description of that transportation up to the dam, I mean, it kind of. I mean, I wasn't there.
Why don't you have a different approach? Why don't you interview the Afghans? Why don't you talk to the guys on the dam? Why don't you stop just writing about the glorious soldiers taking the stuff down there? Why don't you approach it from a different perspective? And the only way you can get journalists to do that is to give them access to something. Then, and then the journalist breaks it and goes back with the glorious soldiers taking something down. And there's a real question here. I'm not saying the answer is simple.
Could I just say, I mean, I don't know anything about Afghanistan. I've never reported there, but there are plenty of African disputes, conflicts in which you would have had 3 different versions of that event. And you would have had the international version of the event, the one-side version of the event, and the other side of the Ethnic divide version of the event, and they would all have been completely different. So we can't be dewy-eyed about the local reporting either. I mean, that's not going to, I mean, you can read the Kenyan newspapers and you know exactly that one of them is supported by President Moi and the other supported by President Kibaki, and you read them in that knowledge, and neither of them are to be trusted.
But the Afghan viewpoint isn't represented here at all, except by people.
No, it is represented. It is represented.
Okay, IWPR, possibly.
But maybe it's not trustworthy either. I mean, that's the trouble. You know, as a journalist.
Depends what you mean by the Afghan point of view.
Yeah.
I mean,
where in Afghanistan?
I did a news night 10 months ago about the reform of the madrasa system. There wasn't a single non-Afghan voice in a 15-minute film.
And I spent a month in Afghanistan making films, absolutely aimed to talk about ordinary people's experiences and writing about ordinary people's experiences, doing no embedding at all. I mean, people do it, but the problem is because it's not easy. It's not safe. I mean, while I was there, a friend of mine got kidnapped. He was trying to, go the step further. And the problem with people who are prepared to go and do that is they're self-selecting. And it's not a big group of people. Most of the people who are prepared to go and do it would feel more comfortable going and doing an embed. And I've done embeds, and I don't think there's anything wrong as long as you can say what it is that the attitudes of the people that you're reporting on, rather than reporting on a line. And I think that's where you know, reporting of failed states like Iraq and Afghanistan is problematic, is that it seems very, very easy to go out down to Basra or go down to Helmand, and you get given a sort of like a free ride through a conflict, but it doesn't actually tell you about an Afghan experience. It doesn't, but it also, because of the restrictions, it doesn't tell you about what the soldiers, for instance, feel about what they're doing. I mean, you've been there, so you know this, and there is this. I think that's the problem. Is it's a requirement for absolute honesty, and the problem is if you're absolutely honest about what's going on, you're kind of sometimes not terribly welcome in places.
I'm going to take a couple more questions and then we'll just round up Andrew. And then
I just wanted to come back to perhaps a more mundane issue of journalism. I speak as a former diplomat and BBC governor, but nobody's talked about the BBC World Service and the vernacular service, and I think that the effect of the vernacular services, in my experience, in many parts of the world, are enormously important in a sense, in a way of disciplining and keeping honest local journalists. Because there's day in, day out a steady drip of pretty balanced, well-informed, impartial reporting. I mean, it's not always perfect, obviously, but it does set out a sort of second or alternative point of view, which helps to mitigate against some of the sort of more extremist, rabble-rousing, politically charged broadcasting that will be going on ordinarily in a country. So I think the BBC World Service has a tremendous role here, which nobody's talked about, but that does seem to be an area where journalism is not letting down failed states. I mean, the BBC Somalia service is the equivalent of the domestic service of Somalia. Of course, the problem is that there's a huge amount of knowledge and experience in the World Service, which doesn't really get reflected back into the discussions and reporting here in the UK, and that's a shame.
Invariably it does. I've done research. Anatol, Fran, John, then yeah.
Anatol leaving King's College. First, just like to endorse very strongly the last remark about the BBC World Service. Speaking as somebody who was a journalist and then a think tanker and then an academic, I have to say in defence of journalism, that journalism is probably no better than the other two categories, except for just one thing. The correspondents on the ground have been there and risked their lives and in some cases lost it, and that needs to be said. A couple of other points are not so cheerful. One is that perhaps, and speaking as a former journalist, we shouldn't make too much of ourselves. Most of us, especially the newspapers, exist to sell newspapers. Yeah. And whenever on the Times I complained about lack of coverage or limited coverage or biased coverage, I was simply directed to the surveys, the opinion surveys of their readership that the Times had done, which showed that most of them weren't interested. And as I was told, if you want to get them interested, tell them fairy stories. There's one foreign editor. Not the foreign editor I most admired, there is that. And so, you know, we respond to our public. Third point, though, very briefly, we're talking about corruption, rule of law, all these things. The rule of law in different societies is understood very, very different in Afghanistan. The rule of law, as we understand it, is understood by people who have been exposed to Western legal systems in Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., as a knife of corruption and repression. But to get that over and to get over how people's own understanding of legal systems in different societies operate is the research, if not of a lifetime, of many years. To deal with the Pashtun tribes in the Northwest Frontier province, very imperfectly, as David has so brilliantly recorded, was the work of a lifetime for British officials. Journalists can't do that, but I'm not convinced that our entire societies are actually capable of generating that kind of research. Speaking as an academic.
I